At a recent House hearing, RepBacon exposed a staggering military scandal. Defense Secretary PeteHegseth abruptly canceled a 4,000-troop deployment to Poland, a U-turn so sudden that military gear was already loaded onto ships and advance forces were on European soil. A crucial NATO ally was left completely blindsided, finding out at the exact same time as the general public. Most shockingly, when a furious Congress demanded accountability, the Army's acting chief of staff helplessly cited Title 10 to prove he had zero legal authority to intervene. This reveals a terrifying truth. The military's top leadership was completely sidelined while a diplomatic disaster unfolded. To see exactly how a strategic breakdown of this magnitude happens, watch the clip below right now.
Yes, sir. I'm not on the policy side here.
But you are the Chief of Staff of the Army. There is no good explanation why we just removed 2 armored brigades from Eastern Europe. There's got to be some explanation.
Well, sir, I think as they reviewed the force structure, the conclusion was that we could repack one of the brigades that are in the rotation. One brigade that's in the rotation pool that we send over to Europe. There's still another brigade there. There's still a division headquarters that's in rotation there. We still have 5th Corps that is over there as well.
But we pulled the brigade out of Romania. Now we're pulling the brigade out of Poland. Is there a plan to replace that brigade in Poland?
That you would have to ask the COCOM commander, sir, on how he's going to maneuver the forces that he has. We still have a force structure that is permanent force structure that's in Europe supporting our allies through both exercises and continual presence on the continent.
I know I may not represent 100% of people in this committee, but I think I represent the views of the vast majority. We disagree. Russia has invaded Ukraine. Have they given us any concessions to withdraw 2 armor brigades out of Europe as they're invading Ukraine? What concessions have they given us as we withdraw forces?
Sure, I can't answer that question.
Well, I know it's none. And this is why it's so foolish. We're sending a terrible message to Russia and to our allies. Here's another question. Do we know if Poland was notified by the secretary?
We don't know.
Well, I already know the answer because they called me yesterday. They did not know. They were blindsided. These are some of our best allies. And they had no idea. They still don't know what the plan is. They know, okay, the order was stopped. They don't know if this is just a suspension or permanent. We owe Poland, and our Baltic friends, who are very vulnerable from this decision, a better explanation here. And a rational, we should be doing this before we actually make the decision. We should be coordinating with them. It's an embarrassment. I'm telling you, this is an embarrassment to our country, the way this is being handled. And I happen to know the answer to this, so I'm going to ask. You said we coordinated with EUCOM. I can guarantee you they did not say this was low risk. Can you verify that? Because I happen to know they said it carries risk. So in other words, it was coordinated with EUCOM, but they did not say this was a low-risk decision. Am I right?
Sir, those discussions, that risk statement from the co-commander back into OSW, it's not part of what the Title 10, of the Army does.
I was just hoping as the Army chief they would keep you better informed. But I happen to know this because I served in NATO. They did not say this was low risk. So in other words, the Secretary of Defense made this decision over some objections of the EUCOM commander. That's what I submit here. I just want to say this is a slap in the face to Poland. It's a slap in the face to our Baltic friends. I think it's a slap to the face in this committee because we've put floors and restrictions on the Pentagon and further reductions in Europe because of what they did with Romania. They told this committee, or the leadership of this committee, that we were not going to, there's no plans to remove this brigade from Romania. Then a week later, it was done. So then we responded in the NDAA to prevent this kind of behavior, and it's happened again. And I think this committee, under the chairman, the ranking member, we got to hold the secretary accountable for this decision. It's wrong. Okay, my second question, I know I'm the Baltic Security Chairman. Latvia and Estonia have HIMARS, but they just have the launchers. They don't have the warheads or the weapons. What is the plan to fill that?
Sure, there is a long-term plan to fill the munitions, and it's part of production and all of that with the industrial base to be able to get the munitions over there. Sir, I've served over there too, so I fully appreciate your concerns.
It's hard to deter when you don't have the weapons to go on the launchers, but I know that our Baltic friends love this country. They're vulnerable. They love freedom. They lived under the Soviet rule. And I think the decision of being slow on helping them deter, but also doing what we did in Poland sends a terrible message. And they question, can they trust America? And that's a terrible thing to happen when you lose trust with your closest friends. With that, and by the way, I say this again, I know this isn't your decision. It came from the Secretary of Defense. I yield back.
So let's start with what actually happened here because the details matter. The specific unit Hegseth canceled is the 2nd Armored Brigade Combat Team of the 1st Cavalry Division known as the Blackjack Brigade, based at Fort Hood, Texas. The unit formally began its deployment on May 1st. Equipment was already in transit. Advanced personnel were already overseas. Then on May 13th, the word came down, the mission was off. Defense News reported that soldiers learned of the cancellation that morning through text messages, notifying family and friends of the sudden change. One brigade member, in a text message reviewed by Army Times, estimated that retrieving equipment already on its way to Europe would cost $4 million. And that's before you even account for the disruption to thousands of soldiers who had already reorganized their entire lives in preparation for a 9-month deployment. Think about that for a second. But here's what you need to understand. This didn't start in Poland. Back in October 2025, the Pentagon quietly ended the rotating troop presence of the 101st Airborne Division's brigade in Romania, a mission in place since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And the official U.S. Army statement at the time called it not an American withdrawal from Europe and not a signal of lessened commitment to NATO and Article 5. Congress didn't buy it. The House of Representatives voted 312 to 112 to prevent this from happening again. 312 to 112. That's a margin that only works if Republicans vote with Democrats, which they did. Roger Wicker and Mike Rogers publicly condemned the Romania decision and demanded that they be included in future decisions. That law was signed 5 months ago, and the very behavior it was designed to stop is now happening through a different method in a different country. According to the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, if the 2nd Cavalry Regiment is also pulled from Germany as currently planned, the U.S. would be left with a single brigade combat team in all of Europe and 0 large tank and armored units anywhere on the entire continent. 0. And by the way, here's what makes this withdrawal uniquely impossible to justify on its stated terms. Poland plans to spend 4.8% of its gross domestic product on defense in 2026, more than any other NATO member, including the United States. Its 2022 Homeland Defense Act passed a law requiring the country to spend at least 3% of its entire economy on defense every single year, and Warsaw has spent well beyond that floor. Every year since the law was signed, Trump spent years demanding that NATO allies spend more on their own defense. Poland spent more, surpassing the American standard, surpassing every other ally in the alliance, and its reward was a withdrawal that its own officials weren't even told was coming. You want to understand what message that sends to every other ally watching right now. Warsaw is already doing the math. Now, Congress had anticipated exactly this problem. The 2026 National Defense Authorization Act, the annual law that sets the rules and budget for the entire U.S. military, passed in December 2025, prohibits the Pentagon from reducing American troop levels in Europe below 76,000, without first officially confirming to Congress that NATO allies had been consulted and that U.S. national security would not be harmed. At the time, roughly 100,000 American troops were stationed in Europe, but analysts at the Center for Eastern Studies in Warsaw identified a critical loophole. The rule allows troop levels to dip below that floor for up to 45 days before legal consequences kick in. 45 days. Keep that in mind. We'll come back to it, because then there's the question of what EUCOM actually said. And this is where it gets really interesting, because the Pentagon's version and the documented reality are two very different things. Acting Press Secretary Joel Valdez claimed publicly that the cancellation was not an unexpected last-minute decision and had followed a comprehensive, multi-layered process. That framing collapsed fast. Stars and Stripes reported that General Christopher Leneve described the order as relatively recent, made probably within the last 2 weeks. Breaking Defense reported that Army senior leadership was informed just a couple of days before the hearing. But here's the thing that nobody in the Pentagon's public statements has addressed. What happens to Genjan Alex Grinkage's risk assessment, the official judgment from the European Command that the cancellation carried risk? Under a federal law called the Goldwater-Nichols Act, military orders flow directly from the President through the Secretary of Defense to the battlefield commander. And Army chiefs like Leneve are completely cut out of that loop. That's the legal setup Leneve kept citing. His Title 10 role gave him no authority over the decision. Grinkowicz did. He told Congress this past March that Russia posed an enduring threat to the U.S. homeland. Then his office was directed to execute an order his own assessment had flagged as risky. That risk assessment exists somewhere in the chain, and Congress hasn't demanded it yet. CNN reported on May 15th that the cancellation was connected to the administration's push to pressure European allies into assuming greater defense responsibility for their own continent. But But look, a second motive runs underneath that one. Trump spent weeks criticizing NATO members in the spring for refusing to support the American war with Thrun, warning in March that the alliance would face a very bad future if allies didn't help defend the Strait of Hormuz. Germany's chancellor publicly called the Thrun conflict embarrassing. Poland did not yet. It was taking the same troop cuts as Germany. Multiple defense analysts stated publicly that the troop cuts looked like payback against European partners for staying out of the war. Unless you forget, he called Poland a model ally and said its level of partnership was unmatched in Europe in February 2025, then candled their brigade 15 months later. That's the deal. And I want you to understand the historical weight here. Operation Atlantic Resolve launched on April 23, 2014, a direct military response to Russia's illegal takeover of Crimea. The entire program was built around a single idea. Rotating American armored brigades through Eastern Europe sends Moscow an unmistakable message that an attack on a NATO ally triggers a real Article 5 response. The NATO rule that says an attack on one member is an attack on all of them, backed by real deployed American military power. After Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the program expanded, and the surge of additional U.S. forces made the signal unmistakably clear. So canceling a rotation transmits a new signal, one received by every capital watching allied and enemy alike and interpreted accordingly. The question enemies ask when they see an American brigade turn around isn't whether it was a rotation or a permanent force. The question is why. And here's what didn't even make it into the hearing. CNN reported on May 15th that the cancellation order went further than the BlackjackBrigade. The same directive scrapped the deployment of the 3rd Battalion 12th Field Artillery Regiment to Germany later this year, a unit that fires long-range rockets and missiles. A command that oversees long-range rockets and missiles was also removed from Europe under the same order. The Foundation for Defense of Democracies laid out how the damage keeps building. The combination of cuts to tank and armored forces and long-range rocket cuts creates gaps along NATO's eastern border that no remaining single unit can fill. Armored brigade combat teams designed for large-scale ground combat send a specific warning to Russia that helps prevent an attack, and forces being moved toward the Pacific Ocean simply cannot replace them. So it's not just one brigade, not even close. Now let's talk about the Baltic states, because the vulnerability RepBacon raised about their weapon systems connects to a separate, equally urgent supply chain breakdown. Estonia signed a contract in late 2022 to acquire 6 HIMARS launchers. Those launchers were delivered in 2025. But the U.S. has since paused weapons and ammunition deliveries to Estonia, a halt tied directly to the war. Estonian Defense Minister Hanno Pevkur confirmed in April that the pause covers ammunition contracts worth tens of millions of euros. Latvia signed its own hire agreement in December 2023. Lithuania completed and publicly displayed its first launchers in May, with delivery to Lithuania itself expected before the end of the year. Together, the 3 Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, are deploying or finishing delivery of weapon systems capable of hitting targets up to 180 miles away. The rounds to load them with are still waiting. You've got launchers with no ammunition in countries that border Russia. And by the way, Congress didn't just set a troop floor in the 2026 NDAA. It also authorized $175 million for the Baltic Security Initiative, a program designed to help Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania buy American weapons and build up their defenses that the Pentagon had proposed cutting specifically to strengthen defense ties through the purchase of key American weapon systems. The Atlantic Council noted that provision was inserted just 3 months after the Pentagon proposed cutting the program. That timing matters. Congress was legally funding Baltic defense at the exact moment the Pentagon was moving to scale it back. The law is real. The question is whether this administration intends to comply with it. Poland, meanwhile, did not accept this quietly. Fox News Digital reported on May 19th that Polish Deputy Defense Minister Paweł Zalewski traveled to Washington to press Pentagon officials and members of Congress for an explanation of the halted brigade rotation. He cited a direct statement the president had made to Polish President-elect Naraki in September 2025. "We'll be staying in Poland. We're very much aligned with Poland. We'll put more there if they want." That assurance is 8 months old. Zalewski spelled out exactly what was at risk. Moscow's long-term goal, he said, is to break apart Western alliances by driving wedges between the U.S. and NATO countries on Russia's border. The brigade cancellation, whatever its stated intent, advances that objective. So let's go back to that 45-day window because what the official record in Congress actually shows is more specific than it might seem. The window isn't a drafting accident, it's a compromise. The final NDAA language was negotiated between the House and Senate, and the 4-5-day exemption was the price of getting it passed. The White House then signed the legislation while at the same time declaring in its statement on signing that the troop limit rules only applied as long as the president agreed they did, because the White House argued the Constitution gives the president final say over the military. That signaled that the White House never actually accepted the idea that Congress could override it on military decisions. It found a door Congress left open and immediately signaled it would use it. That shifts the weight to the 2027 defense bill now being drafted. The choice facing Wicker, Rogers, and Bacon in that process is specific. Will they vote to close the exemption their own chamber helped negotiate in a political climate where Senate Majority Leader John Thun's public answer to questions about him is that he serves at the pleasure of the president? Their answer to that question will tell you whether Congress has a real next move, or whether the system it built was never actually designed to win. Now look, the response in Congress cut through the party divisions that have locked up almost every other issue in Washington. The committee chairman told reporters his panel had not been properly consulted and said, "We don't know what's going on here, but I can just tell you we're not happy." Republican Rep. Austin Scott of Georgia directly challenged the Pentagon's timeline, saying he couldn't see how the claim that this wasn't a last-minute decision can be true. Both men are Republicans who have broadly backed this administration, and Joel Lennon Mackey, a former Finnish defense official, framed exactly what allies across NATO's eastern border are now calculating. For allies next to Russia, it will have to change their calculus. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland are now doing arithmetic. They hope they'd never have to do measuring how much American reliability they can actually bank on when they're writing their defense budgets. And here's the part that should stop you cold. In March of this year, Lithuania's State Security Department published its annual report on the dangers facing the country. The finding was clear. Russia is actively expanding its military forces along NATO's eastern border, upgrading brigades into divisions, forming new naval units in Kaliningrad, establishing a new missile brigade armed with Iskander-Miles, a Russian short-range ballistic missile system in its western military district. If Western sanctions are lifted, the report concludes Russia could be ready for a wide-scale military conflict with NATO within 6 to 10 years. The same month that report was published, EUCOM's commander, the officer later directed to reduce American forces on the continent, told Congress that Russia is an enduring regional challenger capable of threatening the U.S. homeland. The country most exposed to the Russian threat said Moscow was growing. The officer whose job was to stop Russia from attacking said Moscow was dangerous, and the American military response to both of those findings was to cancel a brigade and remove a long-range rocket and missile command from the continent. So the question that leaves open isn't really about troop numbers at all. It's about what kind of commitment Article 5 actually represents, when its credibility depends not on a treaty text or a standing force, but on whether a defense secretary decides on a given day to sign a memo. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope this video gave you something worth thinking about. Leave a comment below with your thoughts because your voice matters in this conversation. If this video was helpful or interesting, please give it a like. Click the bell icon so you are notified every time I post new content. Subscribe for more political news, reactions, and analysis. Thanks again for watching, and I will catch you guys next time.